Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. This time, we're looking at the American Empire, the unquiet eagle at the end of the 19th century. So here's a quote for you. "We are a great people. We are a people imperial by virtue of our power, by right of our institutions, by authority of our heaven-directed purposes," end quote. These weren't the words of a European monarch a few centuries ago, but it was the words of an American senator, Albert J. Beveridge, in 1898. Just a few decades after the brutal Civil War that nearly tore the nation apart, and in the midst of an industrial boom that was reshaping American society at an unprecedented pace, the United States found itself looking outward beyond its borders, flexing new muscles on the world stage. How did a nation born in anti-colonial struggle so quickly embrace a role that looked to many, remarkably, like an empire? Well, let's go check it out. As we've discussed through the previous episodes, the late 19th century after the Civil War was a period of profound transformation in these United States. The wounds of the Civil War were still healing, and the immense task of reconstruction with its promises and ultimate betrayals was drawing to a complicated close. As one contemporary account from the period noted, by 1877, quote, "Congress and the nation had grown tired of the Reconstruction question. The energies of the nation were now directed towards westward expansion and industrialization," end quote. This shift in national focus was not merely a change in political priorities. It unleashed forces that would propel America onto the global stage in ways previously unimagined. The industrial behemoth that America was becoming demanded new resources and, crucially, new markets for the finished goods. Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, in his 1885 essay, The Triumph of America, captured the bullish spirit of the era. Quote, "The United States, the growth of a single century, has already reached the foremost rank among nations and is destined soon to outdistance all others in the race," end quote. This industrial might proved and provided the capacity for overseas expansion. Simultaneously, the very definition of the American landscape was changing. We had already talked about last episode that in 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his Significance of the Frontier in American History thesis. For those that don't remember, he argued that the, quote, "existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advancement of American settlement westward explain American development," end quote. By 1890, the Census Bureau had declared this frontier line largely gone. This closing of the frontier was more than just a geographical footnote. It was a psychological turning point. Turner himself predicted that, quote, "American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise, and that the demands for a vigorous foreign policy, for the extension of American influence to outlying islands and adjoining countries, are indications that the forces of expansion will continue," end quote. The nation, no longer primarily focused on continental conquest, began to look outward for new frontiers, new markets, new resources, new arenas to project its growing power and assert its perceived exceptionalism. Even the New South, which was an idea championed by figures like Atlanta newspaper Henry Grady, was caught up in this industrializing fervor. In an 1886 speech to the New England Society in New York City, Grady proclaimed, quote, "There was a South of slavery and secession. That South is dead. There is a South of union and freedom. That South, thank God, is living, breathing, growing every hour," end quote. He envisioned, this is Grady, quote, "100 farms for every plantation, 50 homes for every palace, and a diversified industry that meets the complex needs," end quote. While Grady's assessment of racial harmony was profoundly flawed, as Ida B. Wells Barnett's chilling 1900 expose Lynch Law in America would attest, The drive for industrial development in the South was undeniable, albeit with its own set of exploitative labor practices, including child labor and black convict leasing. The internal push for industrialization then, North and South, created an economic engine that increasingly looked beyond its borders for markets and resources. The unresolved racial and social tensions from Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, including the violent suppression of African American rights and the brutal realities of westward expansion against Native American populations, two things we covered in previous episodes, provided a disturbing domestic precedent for how peoples would be treated off of our shores. The attitudes of racial and cultural superiority used to justify actions at home against black persons and Native American persons and other minorities were readily adaptable to foreign peoples that would come under our control. This would be part of what was called the civilizing mission, and that would be the hallmark of imperial rhetoric that had deep roots in the domestic experiences of controlling and, quote, uplifting marginalized groups. So today on Star-Spangled Studies, we will chart America's journey into empire now that we've set that backstory. We'll examine the economic, strategic, and ideological currents that propelled this shift. We'll relive the splendid little war, the Spanish-American War of 1898, and its bitter aftermath in the Philippines. We'll meet Theodore Roosevelt, the embodiment of American assertiveness, and we'll hear from those who resisted this imperial tide. And critically, we'll explore how this global reach reshaped America itself, influencing everything from who was considered an American to the roles women played in this new world order. So in order to answer the question, why did the United States decide to leap onto the world stage as an imperial power, we have to understand a few things. The first was that it wasn't a sudden impulse. It was fueled by a potent cocktail, and this cocktail included economic necessity, strategic calculation, and powerful, often self-serving ideologies. So first, let's consider the economic thirst behind this. The late 19th century saw American factories, powered by new technologies and an expanding labor force, churning out goods at unprecedented rates. This industrial engine, a direct legacy of the era that we've previously discussed, was producing more than the domestic market could absorb. So Senator Albert J. Beveridge, who I talked about earlier, a fervent imperialist, laid it out plainly in his 1898 March of the Flag speech, which you can read parts of in the textbook reader. Quote, "Today we are making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets for our produce, new occupation for our capital, new work for our labor." End quote. This wasn't just about offloading surplus. It was about securing a steady supply of raw materials to keep the factories running and finding new avenues for American investment. As the textbook succinctly puts it, quote, "Imperialism had at its core a desire for markets for American goods," end quote. This economic imperative led the U.S. to seek for an open-door policy in China, ensuring American businesses could compete for access to the vast Chinese market, even if it meant joining other imperial powers in suppressing the Boxer Rebellion to keep that door from slamming shut. Strategic visions also played a crucial role in this. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, in his highly influential 1890 work, which was entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, became the prophet of a new American form of navalism. Now, Mahan argued that national greatness was inextricably linked to control of the seas. He declared, quote, "Naval strategy has for its end to found, support, and increase, as well in peace as in war, the sea power of a country," end quote. This meant a powerful modern navy, overseas coaling stations, and strategically located colonies made a country powerful. Without these, he warned, American warships, quote, "will be like land birds, unable to fly far from our own shores," end quote. These ideas resonated powerfully with expansionists like Theodore Roosevelt, who saw a strong navy as essential for protecting not only American shores, but also protecting American commerce and projecting American power outwards. Finally, a potent set of ideologies provided the moral and intellectual justification for this outward thrust beyond our borders. The 19th century concept of manifest destiny, which we had already talked about, this belief in the America's God-given right to expand its dominion and spread its version of democracy and capitalism across the North American continent, didn't simply vanish with the closing of this western frontier. Instead, it evolved. As our textbook notes, some Americans saw overseas imperialism, quote, as nothing new, as simply the extension of a never-ending westward American expansion. It was simply destiny, end quote. Turner's famous thesis, suggesting the frontier had forged American character, inadvertently fueled this by implying that if the old frontier was gone, a new one must be found. This sense of destiny was often intertwined with racial and religious fervor. Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, in your reader, became a clarion call for Western powers, including the United States, which was then embroiled in a war in the Philippines, which we'll get to in a minute. Kipling urged America to, quote, take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. Your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, end quote. This paternalistic and deeply racist view framed imperialism not as a conquest, which it was, but as a noble but burdensome duty in which to civilize and uplift supposedly, quote, backwards peoples, the half devil and half child that he refers to. Reverend Josiah Strong, in his widely read 1885 book, Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis, provided a religious and racial justification for this mission. He argued for the inherent superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, which he saw as the primary representative of civil liberty and a, quote, pure spiritual Christianity. Strong proclaimed that the Anglo-Saxon, quote, is divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper, end quote. He confidently predicted that this, quote, powerful race will move down upon Mexico, down upon Central and South America, out upon the islands of the sea, over upon Africa and beyond, end quote, culminating in the survival of the fittest ideology. These justifications overall, economic opportunism, strategic necessity, and ideologies of racial and cultural superiority cloaked in a sense of duty, created a powerful momentum for American expansion. They were actively promoted by influential figures in politics, as well as those in the military, business interests, and even the clergy, and they found a receptive audience in a nation grappling with these rapid changes brought on by industrialization. This also was fueled by the perceived end of the continental frontier and the desire to assert its newfound strength at the world stage. The call to empire offered a sense of national purpose and a vision of American greatness that looked beyond its own shores. If America wanted to be great, it had to sit at the table with other great nations. Those other great nations, Britain, France, Germany, they had empires. But it's also worth considering how the domestic landscape of the Gilded Age, with its stark labor conflicts and class tensions, might have subtly also contributed to the imperialist impulse. For some, overseas expansion could have been seen as a way to secure economic prosperity overall that might, in turn, alleviate some of the social unrest at home. Senator Beveridge's calls for, quote, new markets for our products, new occupation for our capital, new work for our labor, hints at this. By providing new outlets for American industry and labor, imperialism could be framed as beneficial even to the working class, potentially deflecting the internal class conflicts towards external nationalistic endeavors. With all of these things together, the United States looked outward. So let's turn our focus to the year 1898 and the Splendid Little War. This year stands out as a watershed moment in America's imperial journey. It was the thing that pushed us over the edge. A confluence of events, some simmering tensions, and the calculated ambitions culminated in what the Secretary of State John Hay would famously dub the Splendid Little War. But this little war cast long shadows, fundamentally altering America's global position and relationship with the world. The crucible for this transformation was the island of Cuba. For decades, Cubans had waged a grueling and often brutal struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule. By 1895, the latest rebellion was in full swing. Spain's response, under General Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher by the American press, included the infamous Reconcentrado policy. This policy, as our textbook details, forced, quote, Cubans in certain cities to relocate en masse to military camps, end quote. And these camps were essentially concentration camps. Starvation and disease were rampant. These horrors were vividly reported and often sensationalized in American newspapers, which stirred humanitarian outrage among the American public. Beyond American and humanitarian concerns, American economic interests in Cuba were substantial. The island was a major producer of sugar, and by 1894, quote, nearly 90% of Cuba's exports went to the United States, which in turn provided Cuba with 38% of its imports, end quote. The ongoing conflict severely disrupted this lucrative trade. Then came the spark that ignited the fire. On February 15, 1898, the American battleship, the USS Maine, sent to Havana Harbor to protect U.S. interests, exploded and sank, killing over 250 American sailors. While the cause of the explosion remains debated by historians, the American press at the time, led by what we call yellow journalism of two really important journalists of the time, William Randolph Hearst and his New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World, had no such doubts. Headlines screamed at the time, "Spanish treachery," and also what would become the catchphrase of the war, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." The textbook, our textbook, notes that, quote, yellow journals promoted sensational stories notoriously at the cost of accuracy and called for war with Spain, end quote. And their calls for war, then the propaganda that they spewed, fueled public outcry. And it fueled this jingoistic attitude, and it became immense and overflowed. Recent archaeological excavations of the Maine do show that it did in fact sink because of an explosion on board, but not because the Spanish attacked it. But at the time, that didn't matter to the yellow journalists. So William McKinley, the president who had initially hoped to avoid war with Spain, found himself increasingly under pressure to declare war. On April 11, 1898, he asked Congress for the authority to intervene in the conflict in Cuba. Congress responded with a joint resolution that recognized Cuban independence, demanded Spain's withdrawal, and crucially, via what we call the Teller Amendment, disclaimed any U.S. intention to annex Cuba to become part of the United States. Spain severed diplomatic ties with the U.S., and on April 25th, the United States formally declared war. The war itself was remarkably swift. It was a splendid little war. American naval power proved decisive. On May 1st, Commodore George Dewey, who famously took matters into his own hands, steamed into Manila Bay in the Philippines, another Spanish colony, and obliterated the Spanish fleet. In Cuba, American forces, including Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders, achieved a highly publicized victory at San Juan Hill. By July 17th, Santiago de Cuba had fallen, and the war was effectively over. Teddy Roosevelt would become a hero after this war, propelling him eventually to the presidency. Now, the Treaty of Paris to end the war was signed in December of 1898, and it formalized Spain's defeat. Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba. It ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and in a move that would have profound and tragic consequences, they sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The Spanish-American War was indeed, for the United States, a splendid little war in terms of its brevity and the low American combat casualty. It catapulted the United States on the world stage as a recognized major power. It defeated another major power in Spain. The ease of the victory, however, perhaps masked the deep moral and political complexities of empire that the nation was now embracing. The initial humanitarian justification for intervening in Cuba to liberate its people from Spanish oppression provided a popular and morally acceptable rationale for the war. This, however, opened the door for acquisitions that were far less altruistic, most notably the Philippines. The Teller Amendment, which promised Cuban independence, stood in stark contrast to the annexing of the other territories, revealing the evolving and contradictory nature of American imperial ambitions. This pattern, where an initial noble cause could pave the way for broader imperial actions serving more direct national interests that could be a little bit shady, will become a recurring theme in American foreign policy. If the Spanish-American War was indeed a splendid little war, the conflict that followed in the Philippines was a bitter, protracted, and morally troubling sequel. The decision to annex the Philippines rather than grant it independence plunged the United States into a brutal colonial war that starkly contradicted its professed ideals of liberty and self-determination, and the reason they got into the war with Spain in the first place. Like the Cubans, the Filipinos had a long history of resisting Spanish colonial rule. Emilio Aguinaldo had emerged as a charismatic leader of the Filipino independence movement, and his forces had already been fighting the Spanish when the Americans arrived. Initially, many Filipinos, including Aguinaldo, viewed the Americans as liberators and allies. As our textbook notes, quote, American and Filipino forces under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo were in communication, and Aguinaldo rallied the revolutionaries and assisted the American forces, end quote, in the fight against Spain. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence, and by January 1899, he was inaugurated as the president of the First Philippine Republic. As a poignant appeal published in September 1899, titled Aguinaldo's Case Against the United States, he expressed the Filipino perspective, quote, we Filipinos have all along believed that if the American nation at large knew exactly as we do what is daily happening in the Philippine Islands, they would rise en masse and demand that this barbaric war should stop. End quote. He pointed to the initial understanding of an alliance, stating the U.S. had, quote, entered into an alliance with our chiefs, promising us its aid and protection in our attempt to form a government on the principles and after the model of the government of the United States, end quote. However, American intentions soon became clear. President McKinley, in a now famous account of his decision-making process, claimed that he had been reluctant to take the Philippines. He recounted pacing the White House floor and praying for guidance, ultimately concluding, quote, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, end quote. This policy, what he would call benevolent assimilation, as McKinley had termed it, was viewed by Filipinos as a betrayal. I don't know, what do you think? Fighting between U.S. troops and Filipino nationalists erupted in February of 1899, even before the U.S. Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris. The ensuing Filipino-American War, which officially lasted until 1902, but saw sporadic resistance for years afterwards, was a brutal and costly affair for the United States, and more so for the Philippines. The U.S. deployed over 120,000 troops, and the conflict resulted in the deaths of over 4,200 American soldiers and an estimated 20,000 Filipino combatants, and that's a conservative number. Civilian casualties were staggering, with some estimates reaching 200,000 or more. Some go up to 1 million, largely due to the famine and disease caused by the war itself. The war was characterized by vicious guerrilla fighting in the dense jungles and mountainous terrains of the Philippines. American soldiers, many of whom were veterans of the Indian Wars on the American frontier we talked about in a previous episode, employed harsh tactics for winning. As our textbook notes, contemporaries compared the conflict to the Indian Wars, and reports of atrocities committed by both sides, including the use of torture like the water cure by U.S. troops, became public and enraged people back home. The racial attitudes that had underpinned the subjugation of Native Americans were often transferred then in the press to the Filipinos, who were frequently described in derogatory terms as children as in need of civilization. African American soldiers served in the Philippines, and they found themselves in a particularly complex and morally challenging position. They were fighting to impose American rule on another people of color while simultaneously facing at home systematic racism and discrimination in their own country. Letters from black soldiers were published in newspapers like the Indianapolis Freeman, and they reveal this range of reaction, from loyalty to the U.S. to a growing sense of solidarity with the Filipinos in their struggle for self-determination. One soldier wrote, quote, "No colored man should never again offer his services to protect a government that does not protect him," end quote. The war in the Philippines ignited a fierce debate back home. The Anti-American Imperialist League was founded in 1899 and became a vocal platform for opposition to this drive. Its membership was diverse, and it included prominent figures like the industrialist Andrew Carnegie, labor leaders like Samuel Gompers, social reformers like Jane Addams, even the writer Mark Twain. The Anti-Imperialist League argued that imperialism violated the core American principles of self-government and the, quote, consent of the governed, as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. Mark Twain, he wrote a scathing satire that he called the War Prayer, that exposed the brutal hypocrisy of praying for military victory, which he argued was an implicit prayer for the suffering and destruction of the enemy. Quote, "O Lord our God, help us to tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their patriot dead." End quote. Philosopher William James, in The Philippine Question of 1903, lamented that America had, quote, regurgitated the Declaration of Independence and joined the common pack of wolves, end quote, by engaging in imperial conquest in the first place. Jane Addams in 1899 gave a speech, Democracy or Militarism, and she connected the imperial venture abroad to the erosion of democratic values and the rise of militarism at home. She argued, quote, "To protect the weak has always been the excuse of the ruler, and now at last of the white man," end quote. Imperialists, of course, had their counter-arguments. Senator Beveridge is one that I've already explained, and President Roosevelt emphasized this as a national duty. It was an economic necessity. It was a strategic advantage to have colonies, and of course, he backed the civilizing mission. McKinley, before his assassination, justified of the uplifting work that the United States would do, uplifting in quotation marks, that by Christianizing and uplifting, both of those in quotation marks, that the Filipinos, however paternalistic this might feel, and this would resonate with many who believed that America's exceptional role in the world was to uplift and Christianize and spread American values around the world. The Philippine-American War, therefore, was more than just a military conflict. It was a crucible in which American identity and its global responsibilities were fiercely debated. The anti-imperialist movement, though ultimately failing to prevent the annexation of the Philippines or the war, raised profound and enduring questions about the capability of democracy and empire coexisting. The arguments deployed by both sides often drew upon deeply ingrained American historical narratives, manifest destiny for the imperialists, the ideals of the revolution for the anti-imperialists. This demonstrates how foreign policy crises become battlegrounds for defining national identity at home itself. Furthermore, the racial underpinnings of this civilizing mission abroad were not isolated, but they were from domestic racial hierarchies. The language used to describe Filipinos as savage or childlike echoed the rhetoric used against Native Americans and other minorities during westward expansion and slavery, and in some cases, the new immigrants arriving on American shores. This created a disturbing consistency in how a dominant American culture viewed and treated those it deemed as other, regardless of whether that other was at home or in its newly acquired territories. No figure looms larger in the story of American empire at the turn of the 20th century than Theodore Roosevelt. He ascended to the presidency in 1901 after William McKinley's assassination, and Roosevelt was an unapologetic advocate for American power and influence on the world stage. His foreign policy was guided by a philosophy he famously summarized as, quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far," end quote. For Roosevelt, the big stick was America's growing military might, particularly its Navy, which he had helped to build. Roosevelt's belief in assertive action was deeply rooted in his concept of what he called the strenuous life, the title of a speech he gave in 1899, in which he extolled the virtues of effort, struggle, and national greatness. He preached, quote, "not the doctrine of ignoble ease, but the doctrine of a strenuous life, the life of toil and effort, of labor and strife," end quote. He argued that for America, quote, "to really be a great people, we must strive in good faith to play a great part in the world," end quote. This philosophy directly translated into a foreign policy that was proactive, interventionist, and aimed at establishing the United States as a dominant global player. As our textbook notes, Roosevelt vigorously expanded the military, especially naval power, and then heavily he was influenced by the theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who we've discussed before. The global tour of this Great White Fleet from 1907 to 1909 was a dramatic demonstration of this new naval power. One of Roosevelt's most audacious and controversial actions was the acquisition of the Panama Canal Zone. Recognizing the immense strategic and commercial value of a canal connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, Roosevelt was determined to see it built. At the time, Panama was a province of Colombia. When the Colombian government rejected a treaty granting the U.S. rights to build the canal, Roosevelt, true to his big stick mantra, supported a Panamanian independence movement in 1903. U.S. warships strategically positioned off the Panamanian coast prevented Colombian forces from suppressing the rebellion. The newly independent Panama quickly signed a treaty granting the U.S. control over the canal zone. Roosevelt's actions, while achieving a long-sought strategic goal, were widely criticized as an infringement on Colombian sovereignty and a blatant example of American strong-arming. Further solidifying America's dominance in the Western Hemisphere, was what we call today the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which he announced in 1904. The original Monroe Doctrine in 1823 had warned European powers against further colonization and interference in the Americas. And Monroe really had no way of actually going through with this in 1820s. Roosevelt's corollary went a step further, asserting that the United States had the right, indeed the obligation, to intervene in the affairs of Latin American nations to prevent what he called, quote, chronic wrongdoing or impotence that might tempt European powers to intervene. In Roosevelt's words, the U.S. might be forced, quote, to the exercise of an international police power, end quote. This doctrine effectively transformed the Monroe Doctrine from a defensive shield against European encroachment into a justification for American intervention. It was under this corollary that the U.S. intervened in the Dominican Republic in 1905, taking control of its customs collection to ensure payments of foreign debts, as well as in Cuba, exercising rights granted under the Platt Amendment, which severely limited Cuban sovereignty and permitted U.S. naval bases like Guantanamo Bay. Beyond direct military or political coercion, Roosevelt also championed what he called dollar diplomacy, a policy more fully developed under his successor, William Howard Taft. This approach sought to extend American influence through economic means, through investments and loans, particularly in Latin America and East Asia. The idea was that American financial leverage could promote stability in those areas and protect U.S. interests without the costs and complications of direct military intervention or occupation. However, this policy often led to resentment and further instability in those areas, as American financial interests became deeply entangled with the often volatile politics of those nations. Roosevelt's foreign policy, therefore, marked a decisive shift in the 19th century. While often cloaked in the rhetoric of bringing order and civilization or protecting American economic interests, his actions fundamentally reshaped America's relationship within Latin America, as well as established patterns of intervention that would persist for decades, some might argue even till today, leaving a complex legacy of resentment and dependency alongside any perceived benefits of stability. This policy also revealed an emerging dynamic in American foreign policy relations, the intertwining of American economic interests, private economic interests, with official U.S. government policy. As dollar diplomacy encouraged U.S. banks and businesses to invest in foreign nations, these private ventures often required the American government then to protect them and their businesses and their capital when faced with political instability or local resistance in those nations. This created a scenario where the U.S. foreign policy could be significantly swayed by the needs of American corporations abroad, a pattern that would become a recurring theme and a subject of intense debate throughout the 20th century up until today. Let's turn our focus back home now. The assertion of American power abroad had profound consequences within the United States itself, reshaping debates about women's roles at home. Talk of empire fueled anxieties about immigration, and it forced a national conversation again about what it meant to be American in an age of empire. So let's start with women. Women found themselves in a complex and often contradictory positions relative to the imperial project overall. The civilizing mission, a core justification for imperialism as we've talked about, was itself a deeply gendered concept. As our textbook explains, prevailing racial theories posited a hierarchy of civilizations, with white Anglo-Saxons at the top. Within this framework, white, middle-class Christian women were often seen as, quote, symbols of the benefits of American civilization and as vehicles for the transmission of American values, end quote. They ventured overseas in this time period to be missionaries, teachers, medical professionals, extending the perceived virtues of American domesticity and Christian morality to foreign lands. An example of this is someone like Ursula Sophia Emerson. She was an early missionary to the island of Hawaii, and her notes give us a glimpse of the life of this type of missionary and her work when she was instructing girls there in academics, in singing, in the domestic arts, all a part of an effort to reshape Hawaiian society in the American Protestant image. Some women even became agents of the economic empire. Margaret MacLeod, for instance, traveled the globe demonstrating H.J. Heinz's products, like linking American consumer goods with the advancement of civilization. However, many American women were also at the forefront of the anti-imperialist movement. Figures like Jane Addams, the renowned social reformer, argued passionately that imperialism contradicted democratic ideals. Again, I'll quote from her 1899 speech, Democracy or Militarism, quote, "To protect the weak has always been the excuse of the ruler, and now, at last, of the white man." For Adams and others, the fight against empire was an extension of their progressive ideals. African American women, such as the indomitable Ida B. Wells Barnett, often connected American imperialism abroad with racial oppression at home. Wells viewed her courageous anti-lynching campaign as a form of anti-imperialist activism, recognizing the shared logic of racial hierarchy that underpinned both domestic violence against black people at home and the foreign subjugation and violence against Filipinos abroad. The active participation of these women in national debates on foreign policy, whether for or against empire, represented a significant expansion of their public and political engagement, even as the imperial project itself relied on traditional and hierarchical views of race and gender. The era of empire itself was also inextricably linked to the unprecedented wave of immigration to the United States. As our textbook argues, imperialism and immigration were, quote, two sides of the same coin. The same industrial engine that sought overseas market also demanded a vast labor force, one that the United States could not meet without new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of those being Italians, Poles, Slavs, Jews, as well as those from Asia. These groups were often culturally and religiously distinct from earlier waves of Northern and Western European immigrants, and they tended to settle in industrial cities, things that we've talked about in an earlier episode. And so they formed these vibrant ethnic enclaves, but they faced significant prejudice and discrimination. And in terms of racial hierarchy, they were below others who had come as immigrants to the United States previously. Nativist sentiments then were fueled by economic anxieties and racial prejudices, and these surged all across the nation. Another example of empire changing debates at home. James D. Phelan, the mayor of San Francisco, articulated these fears in a 1901 article, Why the Chinese Should Be Excluded. He argued that Chinese immigrants were, quote, non-assimilative, end quote. That Chinese immigrants were an economic threat to American workers and a danger to American civilization itself. Such sentiments led to discriminatory legislation, most notably the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first American law to restrict immigration based on race and nationality. The voices of these immigrants, though often marginalized, powerfully articulated the pain of this prejudice. Mary Tape, a Chinese immigrant mother, protested her daughter Mammy's exclusion from San Francisco's public schools in 1885, asking, quote, "Is it a disgrace to be born Chinese? Didn't God make us all?" End quote. Li Chu, another Chinese immigrant, wrote in 1903 of the pervasive discrimination that he faced, quote, "The treatment of the Chinese in this country is all wrong and mean. It is persisted in merely because China is not a fighting nation." End quote. The language and justification, those articulated by James D. Phelan, the mayor of San Francisco, that immigrants are not assimilative economic threats, dangers to American civilization, those will be used over and over again, as we will see in further episodes. The acquisition of new territories like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam further complicated questions of citizenship and rights. Were the inhabitants of these new unincorporated territories American citizens? Did the Constitution follow the flag, meaning all people under colonial rule of the United States also subject to the Constitution? The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions known as the Insular Cases from the early 1900s, determined that full constitutional rights did not automatically extend to these new possessions. The court declared residents of these territories, quote, unworthy of the same constitutional rights because they were considered alien races and savage tribes, end quote. This created a legal framework for colonial rule, where the U.S. could govern people deemed unfit for self-rule. Was the same logic used to justify domestic racial segregation and the denial of rights to Black persons, Native Americans, and other immigrant groups. Thus, the imperial project abroad was deeply entangled with domestic anxieties about race, immigration, and national identity. The way America defined fitness for self-government in the Philippines or Puerto Rico often mirrored how it defined fitness for citizenship or social equality for these new immigrants or racial minorities at home. Popular culture of the era, from the World's Fair like the one in St. Louis in 1904, which featured living exhibits of Filipinos and Native Americans, to advertisements in popular theater, often reflected and reinforced these imperial narratives and racial hierarchy, shaping how Americans at home understood their nation's new global role and the diverse peoples it now encountered and controlled, and saw as not only other, but lesser. The empire, it turned out, was not just out there. It was profoundly shaping who Americans were over here and who they were going to become at home. The turn of the 20th century saw the United States transform from a nation largely preoccupied with continental expansion and internal development into a global power with political ambitions. This unquiet eagle, as it's been described, was fueled by industrial might, strategic calculations, and potent ideologies of destiny and duty, and it took flight onto the world stage. The Spanish-American War of 1898 served as the pivotal moment, that splendid little war that almost overnight saddled the U.S. with an overseas empire stretching from the Caribbean into the Pacific. The acquisitions of territories like Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, the intervention in Cuba, the strategic maneuvers of the Panama Canal, and the assertion of an open door in China were all manifestations of this new imperial posture. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt, with his strenuous life philosophy and big stick diplomacy, embodied this assertive American spirit. This Roosevelt corollary effectively declared the U.S. the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, establishing a pattern of intervention in Latin America that would define regional relations for decades. But this imperial turn was not without profound consequences, both for the colonized and for the colonizer. The brutal war in the Philippines laid bare the violent realities of empire and sparked fierce domestic debates. Anti-imperialists challenged the morality and constitutionality of ruling other people without their consent, arguing it betrayed America's own revolutionary heritage. The imperial project also had deep domestic ramifications. It reshaped American national identity. It forced a reckoning with what it meant to be a democratic republic that also held colonial possessions. The racial ideologies used to justify and rule over, quote, inferior peoples abroad mirrored and reinforced the discriminatory attitudes towards new immigrants and racialized minorities at home, influencing immigration policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act and shaping the experiences of diverse groups within America's borders. Women, too, found new avenues for public engagement, both as proponents and critics of empire, challenging and sometimes reinforcing traditional gender roles in the process. The American imperial turn at the end of the 19th century, therefore, was not a fleeting episode, but I would argue, a foundational moment. It established enduring patterns of foreign intervention, economic influence, and a more assertive global role for the United States that would characterize much of the American century, the 20th century, that was to come. The domestic debates it ignited over national identity, race, immigration, and the very meanings of democracy were as significant as the foreign policies themselves, shaping the internal trajectory of the nation. The industrial might that provided the capacity for empire also created domestic social problems, and some historians suggest that imperial expansion was, in part, an attempt to externalize those tensions and seek solutions abroad. The questions raised during this era about Americans' responsibility in the world, the ethics of intervention, and the tensions between democratic ideals and its actions as a global power remain strikingly relevant today. The unique legacy of this imperial turn continues to cast long shadows into the 21st century. So it's worth asking, how do these echoes of America's age of empire still resonate in our society and in our foreign policy today? Thanks for joining me on Star-Spangled Studies. This is Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.